May iba-iba tayong dahilan kung bakit tayo nanonood ng pelikula.
At may mga pelikula na gusto natin panoorin ng paulit-ulit.
Dahil gusto rin natin paulit-ulit na maramdaman.
Ang umibig,
Tumawa,
maglakbay,
at mamangha.
Matuto,
makialam,
matakot,
at sumigaw.
kiligin,
kabahan,
Lumimot,
at makaalala.
magsaya,
Masaktan,
umiyak.
at marami pang hindi mauubos na dahilan.
Ngunit paano kung ang mga pelikula ng mga nagdaang dekada
Ay tuluyan ng madurog.
malusaw,
Mabulok,
o maging alikabok.
Handa ka bang ibaw sa limot ang iyong kabataan?
Handa ka bang talikuran ang unang pelikulang pinanood mo sa sinehan?
Handa ka bang maglaho ang mga karakter?
na nagsama sa'yo sa mga lugar na di mo inakalang mapupuntahan. Handa ka bang mabura mga mukha?
Na minsan ay nagbigay sa iyo ng pagkakataong mangarap.
Handa ka bang tumigil sa paggalawang mga imahe?
na minsang nagturo sa iyong magmahal.
Kailangan na natin kumilos.
Kumilos. Kumilos.
sagipin natin ang pelikula.
Sa pagsagip pelikula,
Sinasagip din po natin ang ating kultura.
Sa pagsagip pelikula,
sinasagip na din natin ang ating kasaysayan.
Sa pagsagip pelikula,
sinasagip din natin ang mga alaala ng kahapon na ayaw nating mabura.
Makisagip pelikula.
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 Hello, I'm Panos Kotzathanasis, and this is Asian Movie Pulse Interviews. Today I'm here with Leo Katigbak from the Philippines. How are you, Leo?
I am very fine, and it's good to see you, Panos.
It's good to see you too, Leo. So, to begin with the questions, you are one of the people in charge of this whole restoration of movies that ABS-CBN is doing. Can you tell us a bit about that, how it started, how it is now, what it's going to do in the future?
Okay. ABS-CBN Film Restoration is actually part of the ABS-CBN Film Archives, which I set up in 1994. Film restoration from the beginning was always part of what we wanted to do, but at that time there was no such thing as digital restoration yet. Everything was analog, so it was very expensive as a process, and there were not enough technical people capable of doing it here in the Philippines locally at a manageable or at a reasonable rate. So while the archives process was ongoing and we were making sure that we were keeping a lot of our films in good condition and in storage, we were always on the lookout for technologies that would come out that would facilitate for film restoration. Around 2009, one of our colleagues mentioned that there had been some advances in digital restoration that was being done, and they did some tests. And then after that, we sat down, we discussed and whatever. Then we looked at what we had in inventory, then had discussions and presentations with management to get their buy-in into the whole process. Fortunately, the chairman of ABS-CBN at that time, Gabby Lopez, he really is a visionary. He always thinks ahead and whatever. So from the very, very beginning, we did not have a hard time convincing management. And it also helped that the president of ABS-CBN at that time, Charo Santos, was also a film producer before, and she's also an award-winning actress. So between the two of them, it was very easy to convince and get them on board with the idea of finally proceeding with film restoration the way we wanted to do it. In fact, Mr. Lopez said he realizes it's something that we need to do, but the big question was, how do we do it in a manner that is viable, and we're not going to lose a lot of money in the process. So the most that I could promise them was I would be very, very responsible in the way that we would be handling our assets, in the way we would be spending the money and whatnot. Now, originally, the plan was it would prioritize the movies that ABS-CBN already produced. But I was also saying that at that time, our film production company was less than 20 years old. And I said that, if you were to do the campaign or if you were going to do the process, what is the value of a 15-year-old movie in as far as restoration is concerned? There's really nothing you can brag about. But I said, to the extent that can we acquire other movies or maybe start with the movies already in our inventory that are that are far older, and at least those will have the pedigree like Ahimala or Oro Plata Mata, that will already have the pedigree of being called modern classics. So to that end, I can start with that, and then when I start restoring a lot of the other movies, then we can piggyback on that, so that at least people will see a good cross section of the movies. So I got the approval to acquire some of the older movies as well, and that's what we did. Initially, we started with non-ABS-CBN produced movies, and eventually we started going into the ABS-CBN productions. And it's been 12 years, and a lot of the older ABS-CBN produced movies are now approaching 30 years. So when you think about it, they have entered into that modern classics category also.
Which was the first one that you did?
The very first one was Himala, Miracle, the one with Nora Honor and Ishmael Bernal. The second one was Oro Plata Mata, Gold Silver Death, which was done by Peque Galiaga. The third one was Ganito Kami Noon, As We Were, and that would have been the oldest at that time because that was from 1976 by Eddie Romero.
And how do you choose which ones you are going to restore each time? How does this procedure work?
When we were starting the restoration process, or the restoration selection, the criteria that I put forward was I wanted it to be director and writer centric, so that you don't end up restoring the works of a singular director or a singular writer where the styles are similar. So the priority then was, okay, while we have access to a lot of these different movies, it would be categorized primarily by director. So if we can do Alino Broca and Ishmael Bernal and Eddie Romero or Mike De Leon, so on and so forth. That would be how it would be prioritized. So we had a master list of the writers and the directors, and within that list, we would have the movies that we wanted to prioritize for restoration. So there needed to be some flexibility on, for example, even the directors. So even if this was our hierarchy of directors, it depends on what we could access. And also within the category of the directors and the writers themselves, we would need to have the flexibility to start with the movie that was actually more readily available to us. Not something that, like for example, I always keep saying that for Celso Ad Castillo, would Virgin People be my priority as one of his movies to restore? Probably not, but that was the one that was most accessible to us. In fact, another movie of his, Tag-Ulan sa Tag-Araw, or loosely, Sunlight in the Rain, from 1975, was one of the movies we also wanted to do, but it didn't become available to us until 5 or 6 years later. The number one movie of Celso Ad Castillo that we wanted to do, Burlesque Queen, which was a festival winner back in the 70s, until now has not surfaced. Although there have been rumors that there is a print that survives in Europe, but until now we've not been able to find it. So we needed to have that flexibility to maneuver within the category, within the titles of a particular director, and writer. At the same time, reprioritize from the list of directors. So what we will do is we'll have a list of maybe 15 directors primarily, and then see which one goes into the sequence. And aside from, for example, when you talk about the availability, you also have to look at, first, are there complete prints? What is the condition of the prints? Are there any legal impediments, for example? Are there like multiple owners? Is this something that we already own fully or we just own partially? In which case we would have to negotiate for the remaining outstanding rights. So those were the kinds of things that we had to get into.
And can you tell me a bit about cost in general? How much the restoration costs? I guess it varies, but...
Well, when we started the restoration, we were originally just doing it here in the Philippines. There is a company called Central Digital Lab, which we partnered with. And they were the ones actually who helped with the pitch to management. And prior to the restoration process, we also sat down with them and we looked at the metrics, we looked at the costs, we would ask for discounts, it would be a volume work, so on and so forth. What would be the items and price points we would be looking at? And then we also looked at a comparative in the region. Like, for example, if you were to ship it out and whatever. Because ideally, we would have to look at a price point that was viable, that was something I could defend to management. So, for certain movies, it depends. The more recent ones, well, let me backtrack a bit. When we say the word restoration, it also applies to practically everything that we will remaster. So some of the titles are not really the old ones. Some are actually even more recent, like 5 years from the time that we started. But if they were shot on film, if we were going to do an HD or a 2K or a 4K version of it, we might as well restore it pristinely already. So that, one time and whatever, then it's ready to go, it's future-proof. So for those more recent movies, you could say that it's between $5,000 to $6,000 based on the exchange rate at that time. But the range would actually be depending on your exchange rate and the kind of work that would be done. It's really anywhere between that and about $150,000. So from our perspective, we really have to look at the films even on an annual basis, so that we will not do all complicated films. We will do a handful of films that were maybe very difficult to do, but some would be simpler to do, and the others would be easy to do, so that with the finite budget that we have, we can actually do at least 20 to 30 movies a year, which was basically what we ended up doing. So, but the rates would generally fluctuate between the 5,000, 6,000, although that only applied to the more recent movies then. But generally, it's always been in the range of about 20 to $45,000 at that time. That would be the range we would play out. And certain movies pushed it to about $100. I technically put a cap at around 150. Well, it was 150,000 when the exchange rate was 40. But when the exchange rate became higher, I put a cap on it. Because beyond a certain point, my take on it is you're already wasting money. Because if a movie is too problematic to begin with, no amount of restoration could bring it back to a pristine condition. And the resources that you're using to try to push the restoration of that particular movie could actually restore 2 or 3 other less expensive movies. So it was always that juggling act. But that was the range.
And how many have been restored up to now?
Well, technically, we were averaging about 20 to 30 a year. But right now, we are at about 210. But the last 3 years have been very, very difficult because of what happened to ABS-CBN. So from about 20 to 30, we went down to about maybe 2 to 5 at most for per year for the last 3 years.
And how do you screen them? How do you make the public watch them, let's say?
Well, again, let me backtrack a bit. When restoration was being done before in a lot of territories, the idea was you restore movies, you have a handful of screenings that goes back to the vault. When we set up ABS-CBN film restoration, I said that cannot be the be-all and end-all of what we're going to do. It has to be part of it. Because if we're going to restore, there is no point that it goes back to the vault. You restore so that people will be able to watch it and appreciate it. So the whole strategy was, restoration is one half of it. The second half of it would be the advocacy of promoting saving our films. Now, the advocacy is the one that pushes all of our other initiatives. So the idea is, instead of just going to streaming or whatever, for a lot of the marquee titles we were doing, we always wanted a theatrical red carpet premiere. Because the idea is, if it went straight to streaming, most people will say, okay, it's been restored, it went straight to streaming, so what? But the moment you have a theatrical premiere and you have celebrities who will attend and you will have people talk about it, it's going to create buzz and whatever, then it becomes more important in as far as people think. They will say, oh, it must be an important enough film because they're going through all of these steps to promote the movie. So initially, we would have the theatrical, and we would hope to have local film festivals that are all restored classics, which was also something that we did twice a year for about 5 years prior to the pandemic. And then after that, you have home videos we're releasing on DVDs. And then we also started releasing on iTunes. So I was actually part of the group that handled that negotiations and deal with Apple so that we could get on iTunes. And initially, we were in just 7 countries. Then it went up to 14. Then it went up to 24. And now we are at 64 plus, with some titles going as high as 89 countries, depending on your language and whatnot. So the idea is you have all of that. But at the same time, we still have our screenings in universities. We have the foreign festivals. So in fact, when Himala was restored in 2012, we got a call from the Venice Film Festival and said that we heard that you have restored Ishmael Bernal's Himala. Is it possible for it to premiere in Venice? At that time, and I think I'd mentioned it in our interview before, it was already scheduled to open in Manila in August. So what I did was I delayed that so that we could premiere in Venice in September and move the Manila opening in December. Because my feeling was, from a marketing standpoint, yes, I'm premiering Himala. It was CNN's best film in Asia in 2008. I'm premiering it in Manila in August. But how does that compare when you say, hey, we restored Himala and it's going to premiere internationally at the Venice Film Festival? Between those two, definitely the Venice will have more of a marketing angle. It will have more of a marquee status when you start promoting locally. You can say that, hey, this is a Filipino classic, and the international premiere even before Manila was held at the prestigious Venice Film Festival. So that gives you a lot of mileage also.
Mm-hmm. And how has been the response of the audience until now, local and internationally?
It's been improving. One of the difficulties that we have is a lot of the Philippine audience. The Philippines is a very young median age. About half of the Philippine population is about 25 years and below. So when you're talking of movies that are 20 years old or 30 years old at that time, sometimes they have been forgotten already, especially if they have not been getting a lot of broadcasts or showings on television or on cable. So in the beginning, we had to go with really marquee titles where even if the young people were not too familiar with it, there are enough people who have name recognition who are familiar with it, so they can help us promote it. So the last 12 years, it's really been the advocacy, Sagip Pelikula, which has been doing the hard work because it's the one that's going to reintroduce the movies to a new audience or remind the older audiences that these movies exist, so that over time, people are going to get used to the concept that, hey, we had all of these great movies before, all of these old movies before, and they may not have been good copies in the past, but now because of restoration, they are comparable or at least comes close to the more recent movies that are coming out. And that's just on the technical level. When you talk about the quality, I would put our restored movies front and center over a lot of the more recent movies. They may be recent, but they're not necessarily classics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in general, how long does a restoration take, on average?
The simpler restorations, like for example, if it's mostly automated and like the ones that I was saying that was $5,000, $6,000, those could actually take just about 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Which would have a manual restoration component and whatever. Most movies, assuming for example you have a lot of people working on it. Like for example, we've had an experience where a movie that would normally have taken a year because of the sheer number of man hours needed was actually restored in like 3 to 4 weeks because they had something like 300 people working on it simultaneously. So it really depends if you're looking at just one team working on it or a multiplicity of teams. But typically, the restoration is maybe 3 to 6 months, depending on the title, depending on the defect, depending on the number of people who will work on it. Some titles have taken longer. Like for example, the more complicated ones, like 2 movies have taken something like 7 years. Because part of the idea also is, okay, if it's going to be very, very problematic, we will not rush through the process. Sometimes in our bid to get better rates, for example, if you are a facility and we are talking, I can always say, don't prioritize us, but if you can work on our movies in your downtime, when normally your machines would not be working, then what would be the rate that you can give me for that one? So those are the kinds of things that we get into. But like, for example, the 2 movies that I was talking about, the reason it took 7 years was because the condition of the prints were in such bad shape that they actually had to be in retrovata for a little over a year because they had to put it through a special chemical process to separate the print stock so that it could be unspooled and scanned. But at the same time, when we were originally getting a quote from retrovata, it was going to take something like 25,000 man hours of restoration, which would have cost us over $600,000, which was certainly something that we could not do. So sometimes you have to bide your time. And then as we deal with a lot of different service providers, you also get an idea of what is their strength, part of the process can they give us the best value. So we ended up working with 4 different companies for those 2 movies. Color grading was done by one company, video restoration was done by one company, audio was done by another company, scanning and cleanup was done by another company. And we were able to bring down the cost closer to the 100,000 mark. But we also had to wait 7 years. So they had to keep working on the films during their downtime.
And how do the filmmakers of those movies feel now that they see their movies, let's say, restored, at least the ones that were alive, I guess? Are they happy seeing their movies again?
Yes, actually, most are happy. Although we've also had issues and we've also had difficulties with some directors who, I guess, in a way, are purists. Like, for example, if we cannot clear music rights, we will change the music. I mean, it's done also in the States for the video release and whatever. But, you know, a lot of these movies were also made at the time where they never asked permission from the recording for the music rights owners. So, the cost of the music, if you will insist on it, may even be more than the cost of the restoration. So, some directors are agreeable and they understand why we need to change the music. Some would prefer that we keep the music but will not fight us on it. Some directors have fought us on it. And they said, if you're going to do a restoration, do it correctly and pay for everything. But the thing, that's not the way it works. I mean, it's not my money, it's the company's money. I have to be responsible for it. I have to figure out a way where the restoration can actually be self-liquidating also at a certain point. It certainly will not be as profitable as a brand new blockbuster movie or a top-rating television program. In fact, when we look at recouping our costs, you're looking at roughly 7 to 12 years, depending on how much the movie costs. Obviously, the lower ones, the less expensive ones, would be much, much shorter. But since you're eventually dealing with a lot of older movies, your costs are actually going to be very, very high. I'm also realistic enough to realize that in the grand scheme of things, the restored movies are not a priority for the audience. Even if they say that they want to watch it, if you're going up against a Hollywood blockbuster or a local Filipino blockbuster and somebody has a finite budget, you will be at the lowest end of the priority. In many instances, they don't know the actors or they remember the actors already as their old selves and not as their young selves in the movies. Or the writer, director, or people involved in the movie are already dead. So there are so many things working against us in that regard. So we have to be realistic and pragmatic in how we view recouping our costs or, you know, getting the audience interested into what we're doing. So the last 12 years has been that process. It's introducing it. Like, for example, I've had a lot of friends who are professors in the university. And they said that, you know, Leo, we have film courses, but because there were no good copies of the local movies, eventually you will fall back into either a European movie or an American movie. But now, because of the conscious effort that we put in also on the older movies, we have about 30 to 40 of the really older movies so that when the academe or the teachers would say, Ahimala, Oro Plata Mata, Misteryo sa Tuwa, Ibong Adarna and whatever, you have a range to pick from pre-World War II to the 1970s. That is a fairly good cross-section of movies. It's not the ideal, it may not be all the best, but a lot of the good ones are there.
Okay. And considering the issues that ABS-CBN faced with the government recently, do you think that this effort will continue moving on? Are there still enough funds, let's say, to do it moving on?
Well, it's been going at a slow process, and we are looking at alternative options for the restoration, which at this point I'm not at liberty to say, but definitely we can still proceed with it, but at a much slower pace. Hopefully, we can scale it up. But to me, because we always designed it as a two-part thing, when restoration became very, very difficult, we just shifted our attention to the advocacy. Because we can proceed with the advocacy with a lot of the older titles that we have. And, you know, there's always something to hype. Like, even the older movies, it may have gone the theaters, the festival circuit, home video, and whatever. But if Netflix gets it, then that's another conversation that we can have to promote it. So right now, it really is the advocacy that we have been pushing. Like, for example, the Mike De Leon movies that were released by Carlota Films. Those have gone the route of the festival, local home video, streaming, on iTunes and whatever, several years back. But now they're back in the news because Carlota came up with a Blu-ray disc of his entire collection, of which we are part of. So there's always something to play around with.
And how do you think that the films of the 70s and 80s, let's say, compare to the films now? What's your opinion on that? Would you say that they were much better or different? Or
I think at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a very, very subjective call. It's a preference. The quality, you can always talk about the quality because of the awards that they won or the reception of the public. But I think generally modern audiences, and not just here in the Philippines, but I think even in the US, will find that the movies shot in the 70s are of a much slower pace, more deliberate structure. That if you're used to the fast edits and more of the plot-driven John Wick or those kinds of movies, you will be very, very bored by them. But if you also have an appreciation for different kinds of cinema, often they say that the movies of the 70s and 80s are still like European cinema, which is like slower pace and whatever. Whether that is true or not, if they appreciate that, then the movies of the 70s will be golden age for a lot of the viewers. So to me, that is a subjective call. Personally, I like the movies from the 70s and the 80s. I like them better than the movies now from a storytelling perspective. I always thought that a lot of the movies before were also better written because they didn't have the bells and whistles of special effects, but they needed to have strong scripts, strong direction, strong acting. In a lot of the movies now, you can compensate by wowing people with the visuals or having pop music and whatever, or a sense of nostalgia and whatever. Whereas movies like The Last Picture Show or The Shining and whatever, I mean, they really had to work purely on the actor's skill, the director's skill, the writer's competence. Even the movies from the 70s, I would say that there are movies that once we've restored and I watch, I'm actually surprised how much ahead of its time it was. But obviously, they suffer from the lack of the technical capabilities now. Like, for example, if they were doing a tracking or a panning shot, which would be practically seamless now, it fits the movie from the 70s and the 80s, but because they were on tracks and whatever, there's a bit of a jitter. And you would think that without that jitter, the scene would have been so much more powerful. So things like that. But I think in terms of content, I think the movies from the 70s and the 80s are far more creative, are far more inspired. Here in the Philippines, because we were under martial law and there was heavy censorship, a lot of the creators had to be creative to be able to circumvent pre-censorship of a movie, even at the script stage.
So, since you mentioned the censorship, did you find some movies that after the restoration are full, like uncut, as we say, uncensored completely, whereas in the past they were screened in the censored form?
To the extent that we were able to go back to master negatives, we actually have like the full versions of it. And we've been lucky that for the most part, a lot of the movies that we have been the original uncut versions. If ever the reason we've had to cut them is not so much because of censorship, but maybe because there's a scene missing. Like, for example, one movie, Haplos, which we've titled The House by the Lake. The original ending is missing. The one with the credits is missing. So we had to sit down and deliberate and decide how we would end it with the current ending. So we decided that at this particular scene towards the end, the scene would freeze and whatever. And as it turned out, when we consulted with the director, that was the original ending he wanted.
Okay.
But he was vetoed by the producers who wanted a happier ending. But because that scene was already missing, it's only available on a VHS copy, so we cannot even replicate it. Then it worked out. So you have situations like that.
And do you see the films, I don't know if it has already happened, but like being distributed normally, let's say in cinemas? Has this happened like a new movie would, let's say? Has something like that happened?
Well, we used to do that initially when Sagi Pelikula started. But after about distributing about 8 movies, we also that's when the realization came in that no matter how people say that they want to support it and whatever, it doesn't necessarily follow that they will do it when it's there. So there were instances where, yes, we had supposedly a 1 week run, but the theaters were pulling us off already because at any given time there's only like 2 or 4 people watching. So they were better off with a newer movie. So what we ended up doing was coming up with a restoration film festival. So it was something that we tied up with the theater. So the theaters or organizations with a particular mall, for example, would look at a schedule that would typically be weak for them, or there would be not enough foreign releases or local releases. So they said that, instead of just putting some other film there, then let's hype it up with the Restoration Film Festival for 1 week. So it becomes a timing issue. So we actually did that for about 5 years, twice a year. And our partners were actually quite happy because it gave the malls, or I mean their companies, a promotional angle. It became an advocacy. They were able to enter it within their company competitions. So the cinema group had this one as an initiative to get people into the cinemas and whatever. So it was playing on different levels. From our end, it was a way to showcase the movies. From their end, they're showing that, hey, we're not just blockbusters and popcorn. We also have an advocacy for the cinema, for responsible viewing and whatever. So it kind of worked out. Then the pandemic happened.
Yeah, okay. And the last question, I guess, can you tell me some of the highlights, some of your personal preferences of all those films that you like the most, let's say?
Well, I have very mainstream pop tastes. So generally, when I watch a movie, if it's like artsy, yes, I'll appreciate it and whatever. But I would still watch, say, Pretty Woman or Jaws or E.T. and whatever, movies of my youth or movies that, as in general, if you repeat, they would be fun. But from a restoration perspective, there are movies that after I've seen them again following the restoration, there is a different dimension to it. There is a different level of appreciation to it. Like, for example, there was one movie that at that time just seemed like a commercial movie. Then when I watched it again, I was telling the director, I did realize that your movie had so much social commentary. And it was so well veiled. But at that time, it just seemed like, a commercial choice. So there are movies like that. At the same time, as we start getting to the older movies, I get more excited about it, largely because of the rarity of those older movies. Like I think I had mentioned to you, like there are only 5 pre-war World War II movies that survived. And when you count from the 40s post-war to the 1960s, you'd be lucky if 10% of what was produced during that time is still around in a restorable format, maybe even less. So when you actually get movies along those lines, it may not be my favorite personally, but it takes on a whole totally different dimension and perspective because it's rare, it's valuable, it is a product of its time, it is a documentation of its era. And for a country that is not big on documentation, and where misinformation is and disinformation is so prevalent now, I think those things that will actually have some historical significance become important. So it's not just purely on an appreciation level, or I am able to separate it. I know what I like personally, but I also know that there are certain movies that are important to survive because they have a larger role to play in the arts or in history or in architecture or in visuals and documentation.
Could you mention some titles maybe or some directors?
For example, the works of Lamberto Avellana or the works of Manuel Silos, none of them practically survive except for the ones that we have restored. Also, I realized that when people are being pushed as national artists, one of the criteria is that there should be a body of work that survives. And that's why certain artists are denied that right or that privilege because there's not enough of their work that survives. So I'm glad that, for example, there are more works of Ishmael Bernal now or Lino Broca or Marilu Diaz-Abaya. I mean, they were directors who gave, Mike De Leon, they were directors who gave us honor, even in Europe as early as the 70s. But for the most part, they've been forgotten by a lot of the younger people now. So they know Zig and they know Mick and they, like for example, something as basic as Raymond Red is a very, very good director. He is an author, he is an artist. But most people now know him as the father of Mick Red. But when you would think about it in terms of art and achievement, Raymond is here, Mick is just on his way up. So to me, it's important to remind people that these great names existed well long before the Love Diaz's and the Brillante Mendozas and the other batch of directors became prominent. Movies like Himala, for example. Himala actually had already been forgotten. People know that it's the Nora Honor movie, CNN's movie and whatever. But unless you have a clear copy of the movie, then sometimes it gets lost because why will somebody sit through a bad copy for 2 hours no matter how good it is?
Mm-hmm.
But like for example, for Himala, until about a month ago, we actually had screenings because it was part of a tribute to the national artist. And there were people who were attending. And what surprised me was that instead of fans of the actress, a lot of the people who attended were students. And to me, that's important because you're getting a new generation to be interested in a lot of the older movies. Just today, the movie Himala was requested by a government agency to show in one of their theaters for an advocacy program that they have. So when you have that thing, you know that, okay, because of the work we did in 2012, until 2023, that movie gets continued exposure and people are excited. Last year, Himala was what we launched our Netflix campaign with because Netflix had gotten a bunch of titles from us and Himala was one of the earlier movies that played. So, you know, unlike before that after a movie had gone theatrically and then it's gone to home video, people will just ignore it. But now you're talking of a movie that was restored 12 years ago, produced 40 plus years ago, and month on month, there's still interest that's being generated.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't beat that.
Okay. Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Leo, for your time.
Oh, thank you very, very much. It's always fun to see you and to chat with you.
Okay.
I hope you don't get bored with me, and I hope you don't think I talk too much.
No, never. You are a very interesting individual, man. Okay, this was ASEAN Movie Pulse interviews from Panos Kotzathanasis and Leo Katigbak. Have a nice day. Bye.